Um, this meeting is being recorded. All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Ashlyn. I am a primary therapist at a local eating disorder treatment center. And I have to do the caveat of please note that these views are not necessarily reflected by my employer. um, I use she, her pronouns. So when you go tell everybody about how amazing this presentation was, please use those appropriate pronouns. And I just want to give you just a brief background that I got into health at every size, fat activism, and passion for treating eating disorders through social justice work first. So I hope that maybe this Love Your Body Week can maybe be a catalyst for many of you to start down this path, because we need everybody to join. So I'm going to be doing a very brief orientation as to how to show up in places to learn and challenge yourself. As was in the introduction, these topics can be really challenging, and I'm going to orient us as to why, as to the socialization that happens that does make these conversations difficult, but so worth having and necessary. I also encourage questions throughout. So if you have a question that's making it to where you can't pay attention because you got to get something clarified, please drop it in the chat. I'm not going to be the one monitoring it, but please let me know if there's something there. I will kind of look at it every once in a while, but yeah, I would really love questions to be answered as they come up, as opposed to waiting till the end, but there will be time at the end for questions as well, if it can wait, because I might end up answering it anyway. All right, so I just want to orient you to my lens. I have drawn from lived experiences and teachers to build my knowledge, and will give them credit for their labor throughout my presentation. And it is important for me to voice that I take in information from the following lenses. And I encourage all of you to explore what dominant identities you are showing up with in these spaces, and how that might affect how you take in this inner information and interact with the people, I guess, in this Zoom room, since you're not interacting in person, but interacting in general. And you'll notice at the very bottom, I have small fat body listed. I know that that was a confusing term for me the first time I heard it. So I'm going to orient us to some vocabulary around how bodies are described in fat positive spaces. So gotta make sure I'm doing all the right things on my screen. So vocabulary. Coming up with terms and definitions is really helpful in social justice, because these categories allow us to talk about privilege and accessibility in the world. But categories also are part of gatekeeping, part of very much this white supremacist lens. So we do need to be careful about our categories, and know that none of these categories are set in stone, and people can identify however they choose. So it's really important to listen to how people identify and accept that, and then move on. But it's really important to kind of gather some general terms to where we can have a conversation using context. So just to orient you, small fat, that's what I am, is at the smaller end of the fat spectrum. In terms of accessibility, these individuals typically can wear some straight sizes or non-plus sized clothing, and they have little trouble accessing healthcare in public spaces, sometimes some. Mid-fat is the smaller end of the middle of the spectrum, typically wears plus sizes, experiences some difficulty around accessing healthcare in public spaces. This is also known as like Lane Bryant fat, which is a term created by the writer Roxane Gay, meaning that they can shop in plus size stores. There's super fat, which is like the middle of the spectrum, limited to only plus size and big and tall stores, which are generally only online, so accessibility is greatly decreased. And they struggle quite a lot with body accessibility in the world, and institutional sizeism. And then we have InfiniFat, which was a term created by Ash of the Fat Lip. Great blog if you want to follow. This is the higher end of the spectrum, only able to shop online, often might not even know the size of their clothing and need custom sizing. Lots of institutional sizeism and a huge lack of accessibility that interferes with their daily living. So these are helpful categories. People will self-identify. Listen to how people self-identify. You don't need to put one of these labels onto somebody. That is not the point of them. The point of them is to talk about accessibility and the spectrum of body sizes and how different body sizes are affected in different ways by sizeism. So that leads us into the meat of this presentation, which is talking about oppression and power dynamics. This is a really complex subject, so I am giving you a brief overview and particularly paying attention to bodies and body sizes in particular. So we're going to start off with this intersecting axis of privilege, domination, and oppression. I hope that this is not the first time you're seeing this graphic. It's been around for quite some time. It's really helpful in terms of looking at various identities that are dominant and which ones are marginalized, and then also really plays into the intersectionality of those. Because if we are only looking at single identities at a time, that is not viewing a person as a whole person, and it ignores the compounding effects of oppression on various identities. And you'll even notice that even in like woke spaces where social justice is centered, weight stigma is often left out of the conversation. You can see that I had to add sizeism. And you'll notice that the dominant identity here is the thin ideal. I know that that's different as to how that shows up with different gender identities and in different regions as to what that ideal is, but most of the time the dominant culture is the thin ideal. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I used quotations around overweight because the term overweight is extremely problematic. But I wanted to use the language that culture uses, essentially. But the reason why overweight is problematic is because when you're saying somebody is overweight, that implies that there is a normal weight that they should be at, or that there is a should for their body. Their body is showing up exactly how their body needs to show up. So saying things like overweight is really problematic, and I would encourage you in any type of writing that you're doing or presentations like this where we have to use the terminology that others can understand to put quotes around it, to specify that you're not saying that someone is overweight, but that's the category that is used particularly in medical journals. So I don't point out the sizeism being like seen because it's like the worst of all oppressions or anything like that. I'm just saying that when we leave out these categories, we are missing important information about intersectionality, and we are missing large groups of folks who are suffering. And by leaving this out of these talks and of these graphics, we are contributing to their erasure. Particularly those on the larger end of the weight spectrum feel that erasure the most. So Sonia Renee Taylor, I'll talk more about her to come, really said it best when she wrote her book, The Body is Not an Apology. All these political, economic, and social issues are about our bodies. They intersect with our race, age, gender, ability, sexual orientation, and a multitude of other ways that our body exists. So while all of these might not be talking about the size of our body, you'll notice that oppression is typically inflicted upon the body and how the body interacts with the world. So I want you to reflect on the dominant identities that you hold in this space. How might those identities and the way that you have been socialized within them be showing up right now in the way that you're interacting with this graphic? By no means am I saying that those who hold dominant identities are terrible human beings. But what I am saying is that you will do harm, because of course you will. You will. We are all humans. We are flawed. And we have been socialized in a society that has been informed by white supremacy, the patriarchy, and capitalism. So I challenge you to first speak these words out loud before I continue on with this presentation of course I am going to do harm. Of course I am going to do harm. Okay, so now that you've accepted that, hold yourself with some self-compassion too, right? Of course you're going to do harm, and you can do better. You know, you can't know what you don't know. But once you know it, then we got to do better. So I hope that my presentation will give you a few ways that you can show up in these spaces as a better ally, particularly when it comes to body size. All right, so my next, more of Sonia. Bodies are not the designators of oppression, but all oppression is enacted on the body. She goes on to illustrate how oppression is a shared experience and everyone with a body is affected. In varying degrees, of course. Refer back to my previous slide about intersectionality, because it is not that we're all affected equally, but we are all affected. Oppression is systematic, which means it is not done on an individual basis. That's not the origins of it. But these systems are upheld by the active and passive assistance of other human beings. So I'm going to say that again. These systems are upheld by the active and passive assistance of other human beings. So if we choose not to act, we are contributing to oppression. That's a really important thing to state, because these are dominant identities. These are the dominant culture. And so if we don't act, the status quo persists. All right. And I want to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So there are layers of oppression, which is why it's so pervasive. We have this outer layer, which is the culture. And this inhabits the beliefs, the values, and the norms that validate the thin ideal and invalidate bodies in larger, people in larger bodies, right? These are all rooted firmly in the patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. So some examples around body sizes, some values that are held that have been informed by these ideologies is the value of health, the value of effort, the value of productivity, beauty, obedience. And having those values has informed the beliefs that fat people are lazy, that they're ugly, stupid, loud, insert all other stereotypes, which then informs and validates the norms of body shaming, health trolling, body comparison, posting before and after pictures. To define health trolling for you, it's essentially when people are commenting on your body or trying to help you change your body or so on and so forth because they're worried about your health. No, they might think they're worried about your health, but that's all rooted in oppression. It's just another way to tell somebody's body they don't belong. And then we come down to the institution, which is our policies and practices that have been informed and validated and backed up with all this scientific nonsense that is all informed by these society norms, right? Where this is where culture, this is where policies and practices typically exclude the marginalized and include the ideal. These are the types of things that essentially signal to us who belongs and who doesn't, like who needs to change themselves to belong and who gets to be comfortable. So some examples of this is that this person was the default for clip art. Like this is what the default human being was. There was no variation, right? That is a way to say who belongs, what is normal. BMI standards that dictates a person's insurance premiums. Being weighed at the beginning of every doctor's appointment, often out in the open in a hallway with somebody you might have just met. Fitness standards in public schools. Not getting a job or being paid significantly less because of the size of one's body. Clothing not being offered in stores, and then having to pay more if you can find sizes that fit you. And being denied life-saving surgeries due to arbitrary weight requirements, because our medical system is very much informed by these same beliefs, values, and norms. And then we get into the personal. So I have these layered because they all impact one another. This is where we might act out these narratives that we have been surrounded by, either explicitly or implicitly. This is also where a lot of interacting with your peers and loved ones comes into play. Like, are you praising weight loss automatically? Do you make comments like, oh, you look great, have you lost weight? Or that jacket is really flattering on you. I'm gonna cheat and have this cookie. Self-deprecating comments. All of these are implicit or explicit biases about good and bad foods, good and bad bodies, what's healthy, what's not healthy. And all of this is all been made up and informed by society. All right. And so now I'm going to talk about how these cycles of socialization happen and how they're maintained. So this is a really meaty slide. I'm just going to warn you. But this model was created by Bobby Harrow, and I was first introduced to it in a presentation by Erica Hines. If you don't follow Erica Hines on Facebook, do so. But this graphic essentially answers the question of, well, why can't we just all get along? Like, why can't we just love each other and be okay? That idea, while it's well-meaning and it's a beautiful idea, it ignores the fact that we are each born into a specific set of social identities related to the categories that I listed earlier on that intersectionality graph. And these social identities predispose us to unequal roles in a dynamic system of oppression. So it predisposes us to these unequal roles. And so, yeah, we all have received systematic training as to how to be each of our social identities. And this whole system is really pervasive, consistent, circular, self-perpetuating, and often invisible. And I'll go into that in a second. But can you all read these little words? You can? Cool. Actually, I think I can. I can't. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in the beginning, you are born into identities that are like socialized starting at birth. Notice that these are all given to you and socialized automatically to you. So there is no reason to blame yourself for your identities or to blame others for their identities, right? These are not individualized things. These are systemically written and maintained. So this represents the situation where we have no control over this. We are also born without bias. We're born without assumptions or questions. And we are either lucky to be born into a privileged situation or unlucky to be born into an unprivileged situation. And it's a lot more nuanced than that because of the intersectionality of lots of identities. And you might show up in different spaces as more privileged or more marginalized, depending on which identities that space cares about more, I guess is a good one term. And then as you go throughout your life, you have this first socialization. This arrow represents the fact that our socialization process begins immediately before we're even verbal. We are given a pink blanket if we're a girl, or we're given a blue one if we're a boy. The rules and norms are already in place, and we subtly, and in many cases not so subtly, are made aware of the rewards of conforming and the consequences to rebelling, right? This is where we get a lot of echo chambers often. It's where you're raised in a household that maybe isn't very diverse in terms of their identities or their ideas or where they're getting that information, because again, we're all socialized into this, right? The next is the institutional and cultural socialization. So this is kind of referring back to my last graphic. This is where institutions that help shape our views and beliefs and help instill within us prejudice or acceptance. So depending on what institutions, what areas you were socialized, you might learn acceptance of certain things and you're learning prejudice of certain things. And these are also a lot of where you're getting these messages so much in who belongs. Like where are you, who's allowed to be comfortable and who's allowed to, who's forced to be uncomfortable and it's their fault. You're getting all of these messages either explicitly or implicitly. And these are happening on both the conscious and unconscious levels. That's important to note. And then there's these enforcements. This is the way in which instilling of ideas, beliefs, and behaviors is reinforced by the cycle of oppression. Behaving differently is not as simply as most of us think, as simple as we, sorry, typo. We are rewarded for good behavior. So if we're conforming to the norms and the standards and the status quo, but by the same token, we are punished for bad behavior, such as questioning, rebelling against oppressive societal norms. This is often when we get labeled as troublemakers or smear campaigns, or you're a kid who's acting out. This is very much the response of a very comfortable society, a comfortable institution, not wanting to do the hard work and change. And so they're like, we're just going to quiet you so that we can keep our comfort and keep our benefits of what's going on, and to avoid those like negative consequences that we continually see as people are smeared in the media for speaking out and told that their truth is not truth, right? And then lastly, we get the results. The final arrow points at which we have all arrived, which are the results of this cycle. We are forced to make a decision, even if that decision is to do nothing. Oh, sorry, that's the next one, sorry. The third circle, this is where the devastating results upon all of us of this self-perpetuating cycle is produced. Notice that it's saying like, dissonance, silence, anger, dehumanization, guilt, collusion, ignorance, self-hatred, stress, lack of reality, horizontal violence, inconsistency, violent crime, internalized patterns of power. Does this sound like our media cycle? Right? Like this is the result of all of this. And we look at this and we are like, oh my gosh, how do I fix this? This feels so huge. How can I have an impact, right? And this is where the cycle of change, how we can exit this cycle, really comes into play. We are forced to make a decision. Doing nothing is the easiest choice, especially for those who are benefiting from this cycle. But we are all victims of this cycle, and we all are hurt by it. oppression hurts the oppressed and the oppressor, again, not equally. But the way we can get more people on board is being like, we will all benefit from changing this cycle. The socialization process is pervasive, which means it comes at us from all sides and all sources. This is also known as the dominant culture. This is the status quo. This is why it's so hard to change anything, because the status quo is meant to be maintained. This is part of white supremacy when we bring up, well, what about this option? And it's met with immediate criticism. Like, if it's not a perfect solution, it's not worth changing. That serves the dominant culture, right? It's consistent. It's patterned and it's predictable. Thus, it's extremely comfortable for those of us who benefit from it. It's circular. It's self-supporting. It's self-perpetuating, which means it's intradependent, which is why divestment and liberation is what's needed to free us from this cycle. If you can start divesting and liberating yourself from believing in these norms, enacting or believing in the beliefs and values, and then enacting these norms, you can start to divest from the circle, which will break it down. And often these things are invisible, which is why I really love talking at these events and having weeks like this, because often these things are unconscious and unnamed. We are learning these things before we can even speak. They're ingrained in us. Oftentimes that whole point of this is conscious and unconscious. It takes a whole lot of effort to learn new things that are especially not just obvious, right? But if we look at the results, it is so worth that effort, right? And that's what I'm hoping to really bring us to. Goodness. That's what I'm really hoping to bring us to through this conversation, and hopefully some really good discussion afterward. This cycle also has another image, which is the cycle of liberation. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to really go into that today, but essentially what it talks about is all the places that you can exit. I know this graphic only shows that, like, you can take action now, but there are ways to take action in every single part of all of this. And that's part of some of the things that I'm going to talk about in terms of being a good ally are part of that. But if this is something that you're interested in, definitely reading the chapter that Bobby Harrow wrote on this, I think it was back in 97. These are not new concepts. We've been doing this for a real long time. And I hope that, like, I'm bringing awareness to this and I'm giving you some action points, but I'm really hoping that this week, this talk, what's going on in our current world right now, will really light a fire underneath you to go figure out more, because there are so many different roles to take in social change that I can't really go through and list how you'll be the best ally, how you can help dismantle this system. It's going to be upon you to do your own research, to do your own self-exploration, figure out what your resources, your talents are, where you're at in your social location, to know how can I best serve this movement. And I hope that that will be a fun process as well as a growing one for you. All right. So coming back to more individualized around Sizeism, I love this quote by Marilyn Wan. The only thing anyone, including doctors, anyone can accurately diagnose when looking at a fat person is their own level of weight prejudice. Just want you to sit with that for a second. If you look at somebody in a body that has been pathologized everywhere, what comes to mind is not facts, it's opinion And it's all based on socialization. And so if you have ideas come up, those are really great things to be like, ooh, that's prejudice. Those aren't mine. I highly doubt those were your original ideas, which means you can put them down. You know, they were given to you without consent. So you can choose to be like, that's not mine. That's not my idea. That's not how I want to view this human, this individual. And is it benefiting me? Is it benefiting them to have these ideas? And then we just get to put it down and do better. So I've already given a lot of examples about how weight stigma shows up in the world. So I want to focus a little bit more on how it shows up on an individual level. So again, with some more definitions, Sizeism. Sizeism is the larger word that really refers to the fact that there is a power dynamic at play. So everything I've been talking about so far. People with body privilege are experiencing unearned benefits, while people in marginalized bodies are suffering unearned pain. Weight stigma is the moral decrediting of person's body and manifests as weight bias, size discrimination, stereotyping based off of a person's size, and fat phobia, both experienced and internalized. Where there is stigma, there is always power at play. I really hope that one major thing you're taking from this is that it's all power dynamics, right? So this is where we have the justification, is what I like to call it, of, well, those people are suffering because of insert stereotype here. It makes it to where you don't have to care about their suffering. The dominant culture has taught you that it's not your problem, it's theirs. So they should just go fix it because insert stereotype, right? When really it's all of our problem that they're suffering. So the dominant culture often gives us this moral high ground because we do have those cultural values, beliefs, and norms to back us. Because weight stigma occurs at both the institutional as well as personal levels. And then there's fat phobia. So I really want to make sure that, like, fat phobia means literally the fear of fat, but phobia is often identified with irrational fears. And I really want to make sure that it's stated that these are not irrational fears, because being fat is stigmatized. It makes sense why people would fear to be fat or to have a higher body weight, right? And so that's not saying that we should have to fear that, right? I just want to normalize that fear and then change the society to where that doesn't need to be a fear we have anymore. So there are two different types of fat phobia, and these were defined by Virgie Tovar, who is a fat activist. And so internalized is essentially when a person starts to apply the negative thoughts and stereotypes about weight and size on themselves and believe that the only way to fix those negative thoughts and feelings is by losing weight, changing their body. This can impact literally anyone, regardless of size or shape. And as an eating disorder therapist, this is often what is driving eating disorders, is this internalized fat phobia. And then there's externalized fat phobia. This is how we typically think of stigma and discrimination. This is when a person is treated poorly or unfairly based solely on their weight and size. All right. So another lovely quote. This is by Naomi Wolf. A culture fixated on female thinness is not an obsession about female beauty, but an obsession about female obedience. Dieting is the most potent political sedative in women's history. A quietly mad population is a tractable one. All right, so now we're going to talk about the consequences of diet culture on a personal level. So I'm going to go real quick through here. But diet culture has consequences both emotionally and physically. So I'm going to talk about the physical first, because that's typically where people get motivated to go on a diet or to participate in diet culture, however that is, whether it's supporting others participating in diet culture or being in your own dieting mind. So the first thing I want to state is that the thing that research has really found is that dieting is a future predictor of weight gain. And 75% of people actually gain more weight after they've dieted, because our body is so vested in our ability to survive that it adapts when it's been starving. As when it gets food again, it's like, okay, we might go through another famine, and it changes its physiology to combat the violence that is inflicted upon it by going on diets. Dieting weight goes up over the course of a lifetime. So if particularly yo-yo dieting, when you diet and you lose a certain amount of weight and then you gain that weight back, potentially more, the more often you yo-yo, the more your weight is going to fluctuate up, because your body is like, I need to really protect from all of these famines we're going through. You get a slowed metabolism. When we start eating less, our body's like, okay, I gotta shut down some systems. I gotta go into reserve mode. And so our metabolism shuts down. Also, the more and more you diet, the more the diets get shorter. And thus the negative self-talk, the criticism towards ourselves ensues. And that really affects our mental health. When it's not you, the individual, that's failing, it's this whole idea that dieting is a thing. When 98% of people who diet, it doesn't work for them, right? And then eating disorders is a large outcome of dieting. So I already kind of spoke to some of the emotional, but it really erodes self-trust, because never once does anybody take responsibility for, like, if you show up to Weight Watchers or WW or whatever it's calling itself these days, and you didn't lose weight, whose fault is it? It's yours. It was your willpower. It was, you didn't plan enough. Not that, hey, diets don't work. It's your fault, right? And that keeps you very focused and buying a lot of things on dieting and not looking at the larger issues, right? It increases guilt and shame, increases preoccupation with food and body, it increases the belief that one suffers from a lack of willpower. It perpetuates that foods are good and bad, right and wrong. There's good and bad ways to do things, this very black and white thinking. Contemplation of dieting brings on urges and cravings of these bad foods, or those like Last Supper meals that encourages binging. It really entrenches you in this binge guilt diet binge cycle. And I can't illustrate this better than freaking COVID. We get this idea, this scarcity mentality, and everybody goes and buys toilet paper, right? Because we are driven to survive. And so we think there's going to be scarcity. So we got to go out and get everything we possibly can. And then we continue to restrict, even though we have plenty of toilet paper, we're really afraid that we're going to run out of it. And so we restrict it. And then the moment more toilet paper is available, we got to buy it up. And then we get really guilty, like, ooh, am I contributing to this problem? Am I taking away toilet paper from other people? You hear about other people not having toilet paper and you're like, maybe I should give it to them. But at the same time, like, I got to keep that for myself. And so then it's like, ooh, I don't like the way I'm acting. I should change, which insert diet here. I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to make these changes. I'm going to have these outcomes. And then that doesn't work. And so it's like, oh, I'm a failure. And then you go back to the binge restrict cycle, right? Feeling that one does not deserve to eat. That deserving part comes up a lot as that self-critic increases. Social withdrawal. That's one of the main protective factors for preventing eating disorders is maintaining social connections. And dieting cycles increase isolation. Behavior witnessed by children. So all of these behaviors are being witnessed by children. Children as young as 6 are dieting and are obsessed with their weight. I also want to just make sure and say the caveat that don't discount dieting or wanting to lose weight as just a vanity thing. How someone interacts with food in their body is nuanced. Whatever behaviors they're engaging in, they have arrived at them for a reason. Our bodies are extremely wise and will adapt. So approach with non-judgmental curiosity to further understand how these behaviors are serving and or harming other individuals. It's particularly important if you're any type of clinician working with individuals who are actively trying to lose weight or engaging in eating disorder behaviors, to really approach them with a lot of empathy and curiosity to understand why they are doing this. All right. Running out of time. Here we go. So how to show up and be a better ally this week and beyond. Here are the really important tips, but specifically for this week. I'm drawing a lot of what I learned at the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health, also known as ASDA conference that was in Portland back in 2018. I would encourage everyone, no matter if you're a clinician or just going to school for something that doesn't have to deal with caring for humans, to sign up for this association. You can, I think it's like $5 is the minimum annual fee, or you can choose to donate however much you want to. They have fantastic resources and a lot of free education, and it's ASDA. There you go. Yeah, so at this point in my talk, this is where those with more marginalized identities probably already know all this stuff, right? But for those of you with more dominant identities, I encourage you to listen up, take notes, whatever you need to do to take this in. All right, so you have been challenged. I want you to step outside your comfort zone. I hope you've done that with today's talk. No one learns comfortable. If you're comfortable, you're not learning new things. I want you to take care of yourself at the same time, because if we get too far outside our window of tolerance, we're also not learning anything. So you just got to find that sweet zone of challenging yourself, new experiences. Maybe your heart's racing a little bit, but not to the point where you're just so overwhelmed that you shut down. Okay. If you find yourself wanting to answer a question posed or be the first one to talk in a small group discussion, and you hold a dominant identity in that space, pause and ask yourself why you're talking. Is it because you feel really comfortable and you feel like your opinion, your question, is really important? Maybe pause for a little bit and allow some of the other marginalized identities to talk first and to ask questions first. Because their voices are often the ones that are not heard and not contributed to the conversation, especially when it's a whole lot of dominant identities all talking about them in front of them, right? That's not helpful. So center fat voices, center marginalized voices. I guarantee you will learn something. Note that this does not mean to ask to be educated by marginalized folks. This is not their job. Ask me, please ask me, and I will help. But if individuals are volunteering their lived experiences, that is when you listen up. That is when you learn. That is when you transform. Asking to be educated. This is a labor that you can pay many folks for, and you should. So for this week, I encourage you to utilize Google, explore a little deeper within yourself, talk to someone that you know will challenge you or a mentor, take responsibility for your own knowledge gaps. There's so much information out there. You can go find it. Get comfortable with the word fat, especially if other folks are using it to identify themselves. Challenge your own fat phobia. Notice if the skinny shaming argument is coming to mind and how this might be reflective of reverse racism and how it's not a thing. Okay. So when I'm saying that all bodies are impacted by oppression, it's so true, but there is no such thing as skinny shaming in a systematic lens. There is individual acts of bias inflicted upon people, but at a systematic level, there is no such thing. Okay. Because that is the dominant identity. And if that is something that's bringing up defensiveness in you, that makes so much sense because that's not what you've been taught. So I really want you to take a little bit of time to sit with that. And it's not in the name of health, believe me. So watch the health and control and health and concern trolling. Seek out information and stories from, oh, that's supposed to say from fat, thriving individuals. There are so many podcasts and blogs out there that you can read. If you are only interacting with the suffering of these individuals, you are still contributing to their erasure. They have so much more, like their body size is the least interesting thing about them. So learn more. If you hear or see something that is messed up, like problematic, say something, do something. That immediacy is so important. Obviously, check in with your own safety in that moment. Listen to your instincts. Again, your body holds a lot of wisdom. Listen to that. And notice if it's only just a little uncomfortable for you to do it. If it's only a little uncomfortable, you need to do it, right? If it's gonna not be a safe situation, then I understand, right? And hold compassion and understanding for yourself. Again, with the we don't know what we don't know, but I hope now that you all kind of know some. And so now it's time to challenge yourself and do better. Make this world more loving, more accepting, more accessible. So throughout this week, if you notice defensiveness arising, respond to it with acknowledgement and understanding that that is your growth edge, and then expand it. Bump up against those edges, and then go do the things that need to happen to expand past them. This is really all I can ask you to do. All right. So one more thing. I would love for all of you to take a second, reflect back on this presentation, and set an intention for yourself around how you want to show up to everything this week. Whether that's continuing to show up to talks and activities, or if that's coming to class or interacting with your social circles. Maybe this intention is to monitor your critical thoughts and meet them with self-compassion. Maybe you're typically a very vocal person, but you're going to purposefully remain quiet and listen this week. Or maybe it's the opposite and you're going to talk more since you're typically quiet. It could be literally anything. I just want you to write down your intention and keep it somewhere that you can check in with yourself around it as the week goes on. And then let me know if you have questions.